Ishikawa Goemon, garbed in magnificent robes, stands atop the richly decorated gate of Nanzenji Temple. Pipe in hand, he reminisces on the beauty of a sunset amid the music of drums, shamisen and flutes when a white-winged hawk lands on the railing. The thief notices a message the hawk carries and reads it. It is the dying wish of Sosoke, written before his death at the hand of Hisayoshi. Goemon realizes he must be the lost son of the dead general and swears revenge on Hisayoshi. Guards, overhearing the declaration, rush in to stop Goemon, who repels them with ease. But his sworn enemy, Hisayoshi, is revealed to stand under the gate. He is dressed as a pilgrim, but well able to hear the declaration of vengeance and calmly recites a poem. Though there is an end to the sands on the beach, there is no end to the number of thieves in the world. Enraged at those words, Goemon yells, "How dare you!" and throws a dagger at Hisayoshi. With a swift gesture, the man raises a water ladle and catches the dagger out of the air. He turns, calmly thanking his attacker for the donation, while Goemon towers above him, preparing to draw his katana. This is one of the most famous and recognizable scenes of Kabuki, and I imagine any one of you who isn't already well versed with Kabuki or the people depicted will have one question. What? So, today we're going to talk about the one, the only Ishikawa Goemon, greatest thief in all Japan. Someone who's as close to being a fictional character as you can be while being a historical figure. And don't worry, we're going to return to that scene once we have a bit more context. But first, I'm gonna have to return to my traditional moaning about the sources, or so you'd think. Yes, I have been struggling with finding academic texts, or indeed much beyond regurgitated blog posts in English, and I'm not good enough to read any Japanese books that I might have come across. But I'm not that bothered about it this time, because there are, as it turns out, only a handful of sources about the historical figure of Ishikawa Goemon to begin with. And even those don't tell us all that much. All of them relate to his execution for one, and even the earliest source, a biography on Toyotomi Hideyoshi, only mentions Goemon's execution together with his mother and 27 others in passing, calling him simply a thief. The first source that mentions anything concrete about his crimes is from 1642. For context, according to Hideyoshi's biography, Goemon was executed on the 10th of August 1594. So that's about 50 years of rumor, gossip and possibly propaganda. Anyway, this source mentions mugging, robbery and, if I'm translating this correctly, treacherous rebellion. As mentioned before, all of these sources focus on Goemon's death at the hands of an executioner, and indeed, Goemon's end is probably the most consistent part of his story. What we actually know is that, after his rebellion and/or raiding of the countryside was put to an end at the behest of Toyotomi Hideyoshi, so was his life. Our sources are quite clear that he was executed by the Sanjo River in Kyoto by, and this is where it gets a bit grim, being boiled to death. In fact, while this is what we know for certain, folklore adds a few more details and, trust me when I say, this one's not for the faint of heart. We already discussed that his mother was likely one of the people executed together with Goemon. But a popular story is that his son too was scheduled to be executed with him. The story goes that Goemon lifted his son above his head to save him, and that the powers that be were so impressed by his paternal loyalty that the son was indeed spared, while his father was still, and I cannot stress this enough, boiled to death. There are other, darker versions of this. One where Goemon plunges his son into the oil when he realizes his strength is failing, thereby killing him quickly to shorten his agony. And yet another where he then lifts the corpse above his head as an accusation to the onlookers. Don't say I didn't warn you that this was getting grim. This tale of the end of Goemon is one of the more persistent parts of the myths surrounding him, second probably only to his being a thief. Indeed, this story is, or at least was, so well known that a certain type of bathtub is actually called Goemon Bukuro, which translates to Goemon bath. Not the kind of thing I want to think about when I climb into a bath, but to each their own I suppose. One interesting detail I came across is that there's a subtle difference here. The term Goemon bath used to describe this kind of bath, a metal bottom which is extended upwards by a wooden frame. Nowadays, many Japanese people would call this bath a Goemon bath as well, but traditionally it was called a Choshu Bukuro. The difference being that a Choshu Bukuro was made entirely out of metal, making it quite similar to a rice pot, and indeed, if we compare this design to the Kamado oven, the similarities become quite clear. The Goemon bath, meanwhile, only has the very bottom out of metal, which leads to potential leakages and also, since wood doesn't carry heat as easily as metal, causes the water to warm more gradually from below. Both of these baths have an interior bottom made from wood to shield the bather from touching the metal that is being heated directly. No info on whether Goemon was afforded the benefit of one of those. It would have been a slim comfort. Notably though, depictions of Goemon's execution tend to put him in a Choshu Bukuro rather than a Goemon bath, which goes to show you that no marketing department in history has ever cared for historical accuracy. Speaking of historical accuracy, we've run out of firm facts. From here on out there are several books, mangas and plays that deal with the life and, invariably, death of Goemon, but these stories vary wildly and there's no dependable source on what he actually did to earn himself one of the less family-friendly death scenes. I haven't found any source that confirms this, but my personal theory is that everybody already knew what had happened. People don't tend to describe things everybody knows about already. That's why you'll find a strange lack of literature about how to use a paperclip, even though, if you had never seen one before, you might not even know what possible use something like that might have. And don't tell me that there's like a million explanations online, including some erotic fanfictions. That's because the internet is saturated to the point where people will write about anything damn it, for some sweet clicks. Don't forget to share, like, comment and subscribe. Point is, people might not have seen the need to write down anything the historical Goemon did, because everybody they talked to about it already knew. But why did Goemon stories get so popular in the Edo period? Well, that's hard to prove. But I think its existence struck a nerve with the populace. We don't know exactly what he did, but there are a few stories about him directly opposing the shogunate, including failed assassination attempts. Now, as I said, we don't know how much of that is true, but my personal theory is that something along the lines of that was at least thought to be true at the time. I'm speculating based on literally nothing here, but I think it highly unlikely that he tried to assassinate the shogun, or, if he did, that he got anywhere near him as the stories tell. I think it's more likely that he opposed the shogunate in a less action-oriented way. He was probably a successful bandit and/or bandit leader for a longish time, which puts him in opposition of the shogunate by default. It's possible that he also targeted government property explicitly. The government and merchants were the most likely to have anything worth stealing after all. Now, maybe he even announced his opposition to the shogunate in some way. People can be dramatic and success can go to people's heads. There's certainly no shortage of stories where he does exactly that. I think it's unlikely that he did, but that doesn't matter so long as people believed that he did. See, a rumor like that spreading would have much the same effect on the public and, indeed, the shogunate as the truth spreading if it was true. Either way, the insult to the shogunate would stand and the need to publicly crush Goemon would be much the same. Because the fact of the matter is that Goemon, whichever way you look at him, is a transgressive figure. He's a commoner who stood, whether in truth or just in the perception of the public, against the shogunate where countless noblemen, samurai and even damn warrior monks had failed or fallen in line. You have to remember that the shogun himself, Tokugawa Ieyasu, had reunited or arguably united the country just very recently. There had been over a century of warfare and no reason to assume that the peace that followed was going to last as long as it did. Meanwhile, there was tension in the country's leadership as the shogun was supposed to be in charge of the military, not the country. But he had effectively supplanted the Tenno without actually removing him from power, and even the peasants would have been keenly aware of that. They would also have been aware of and indeed subjected to the increasingly harsh laws laid down by the shogunate, which increasingly dictated even minor details of people's lives while continually entrenching the class system which had previously been more relaxed. Eventually, the shogunate dictated hairstyles, which clothes and even fabrics people were allowed to wear based on their class. It also disincentivized intermarriage between classes and empowered the military class to the point where samurai had the right to just execute commoners with no repercussions. In short, the shogunate was just generally a party pooper. All of this, even though Toyotomi Hideyoshi had been a commoner and even Tokugawa Ieyasu, who took over after him, had started out as only a minor daimyo. But you see the tension here, right? The regime was new and oppressive and in opposition to the more traditional imperial rulers, which had been more lax. Probably because they couldn't actually afford to tighten their grip, but lax is lax, you know? And in that environment, we have the figure of Ishikawa Goemon, who opposes the rule of the shogun. Sure, he's a criminal, but anyone who opposes the government is a criminal. And he gave money to the poor, at least according to some stories. So is it any wonder that he would become popular in this context? But let's have a closer look at what at least some of the tales about him are. Keep in mind that this is only a selection. There are simply too many to provide any kind of exhaustive list in the context of a single video. Some say that Goemon studied to become a ninja in Iga, or that he even founded the ninja tradition to begin with. Some stories claim that he gave stolen money to the poor, or that he stole the capstone of a 13-story pagoda in Uji and donated it to Fushimi-ku Shrine in Kyoto as a thank you when he was able to hide there from his pursuers. The capstone in question can still be seen at the shrine to this day. Other stories say that his hideout was a mochi store near the Hokoji temple in Kyoto. There's another story according to which one of Hideyoshi's vassals asked him to assassinate Hideyoshi, which failed when Goemon knocked over an incense burner which woke Hideyoshi. It is also said that the pot in which he was executed was kept first at a government bureau and then at a prison, before being lost in the Second World War, possibly used as scrap metal. One of the more common stories is that he tried to steal or stole the shachihoko of a castle. A shachihoko is the, occasionally gilded, fish on the corners of some Japanese mansions. They are yokai, which is to say mythical creatures, and they are supposed to protect from fire and lightning strikes. This story is so popular that it's the only one I found a full book in English for. A children's book, true, but a book nonetheless. Said story casts Goemon in a sort of Robin Hood role, stealing from the rich to give to the poor. He sees the golden shachihoko on top of Nagoya Castle. Other tales place the action around other castles, and decides that they are just the thing he needs to give away. But the thing about things on top of other things is that you have to get past the bottom thing to get to the top thing. If the lower thing is a castle, that can be unnecessarily difficult. That's kind of the point of castles. And this is long ago, when most castles still didn't admit tourists. And anyway, the shogunate is like really uncool about just letting him climb on the roof. Remember what I said about being a party pooper? This is why. So Goemon decides the best way is to fly up. Not being from Krypton, he needs some help for takeoff. So he decides that he should fly up in a kite. But since the personal transport kite hasn't taken off yet, he has to build his own. He apprentices to a kite master, and after some time of training where he becomes obsessed with dragon kites, he builds a, take a wild guess, dragon kite. He flies up, manages to steal the shachihoko and lets the kite be carried off by the wind, after getting back down. Until here, the story is based on a legend about Goemon, but in its original incarnation it seems to have been about Kinsuke Kakinoki, another real thief, though in this case we apparently have reason to believe that his actual feat was to break into a Nagoya Castle storehouse and escape by boat. For a bit. He was later executed too. Here, the book's story takes a turn, as Goemon gets found out and caught, but just before the execution the kite returns, having turned into a real dragon that carries Goemon and the others who were supposed to be executed off to live happily ever after somewhere far away. Still in Japan though, so realistically he's gonna come across a shogunate, but you don't complain to a dragon, you know how they can be. Here we come across a common theme in Goemon tales, the need to address the circumstances of his death. With Goemon's execution being the most famous thing about him, and one of the few things that are universally agreed upon, most every story, if it is long enough, has to deal with it in some way. Whether to come up with some elaborate explanation how he escaped, like a recent Kabuki play which featured a half-Spanish Goemon who dances flamenco and eventually escapes to Spain, or by dealing with the execution by addressing its aftermath, like the character Goemon Ishikawa XIII in the anime and manga Lupin III, who is a descendant of the legendary Goemon Ishikawa. Another common thing is the recontextualization of Goemon's death. We can already see this in the different accounts of his death. Holding his son over his head and saving him gives a different meaning to his death than trying and failing, which is different again than giving up and plunging the boy into the oil to shorten his suffering, and is yet more differenter from holding the dead remains up again as an accusation to the onlookers. With the topic of recontextualizing a death, we return to Kinmon Gosan no Kili, or The Golden Gate and the Paulovina Crest, which is a Kabuki play from the beginning. Right, before we get into this, what I'm going to do here is to give a summary of the action of a play that I am unable to translate or even follow without help. It's also an old play from Japan, so neither my bachelor in modern Japan nor the one in English literature are making me an expert on the interpretation of Kabuki plays. So take the following interpretations with a grain of salt. I am making an earnest effort here, but there could be an enormous amount of cultural context that escapes me entirely. But back to the play. We start off as Goemon, disguised as a high-ranking Buddhist priest of Nanzenji Temple, infiltrates the court of Hisayoshi, the shogun. Okay, quick aside, it was illegal to portray the shogun in a play, so they came up with fake names which everybody knew to be symbolic for the real thing, much like people these days do with company names. And ain't that a depressing comparison. Hisayoshi is the name used to obfuscate the fact that you are talking about Toyotomi Hideyoshi, one of the 3 unifiers of Japan. Anyway, at Totally For Real's not Toyotomi Hideyoshi's court, we promise, Goemon, disguised as a priest, admonishes Hisaaki, the younger son and heir of the shogun, for spending too much time in the pleasure quarters. Hisaaki had just been made the heir because of his older brother Hisatsugu's disgraceful behavior and, well, apparently it runs in the family. As heir, Hisaaki carries the official seal of his clan. Or so he thinks, until he finds out that Goemon has stolen it. At this point, the latter conveniently reveals himself, announces what he has done, and that he plans on taking over the clan before escaping. But there's more afoot in the house of Hisayoshi, as it is soon revealed that Hisatsugu, the older brother, is under house arrest in the house of his chief retainer, a disguised So-Soke. So-Soke was a Chinese general ordered by the Ming Emperor to take over Japan, but he failed and decided he should infiltrate the shogun's family instead. His failure to make Hisatsugu, the unruly older brother, behave, thereby losing the shogun's son his inheritance, should force So-Soke to commit seppuku. But instead of stabbing himself, he takes a stab at stabbing Hisatsugu, who really seems to be at fault in any case. He takes the clan's banner and reveals that had been his plan all along. So all in all, it would seem that this has been a bad weekend for the shogun's family. But Hisatsugu reveals that he knew of the deception and deliberately goaded So-Soke into revealing himself. Cornered, So-Soke burns incense and plays a koto, as doing so is said to bring magical help. And indeed, the painting of a white falcon on a hanging wall scroll comes to life, and he writes a dying message in his own blood and sends it flying. Finally, the shogun's warriors appear. Maybe they were on a break or something, and So-Soke decides to commit seppuku rather than let the enemy take him. The action returns to our protagonist and the scene we described at first, with Goemon set atop the gate of Nanzenji. There, the falcon finds him and Goemon pieces together what has happened and that So-Soke was his father. And you thought the shogun's family situation was complicated with all those names beginning with his. Anyway, Goemon swears revenge, repels the attackers, the stage raises, yada yada yada, Hisayoshi appears. Now, remember, the shogun, though dressed as a pilgrim, is Goemon's enemy 3 times over now. As the ruling authority, he's the enemy of all thieves, he's the man in charge of the country both Goemon and his father wanted to take over, and he's the man Goemon swore revenge against for killing his father. This is when Hisayoshi recites the poem, and Goemon throws a dagger, which Hisayoshi catches with his ladle, thanking Goemon for his donation. See, already the scene makes more sense, but we get back to it one more time just to be sure. In the next scene, we meet Segawa Uneme, the retainer of Hisaaki, the unsealed brother. In order to secure the seal, Segawa Uneme takes a position at a mochi store. Remember the story that Goemon's hideout was in a mochi store? That's what this refers to. Well, when the man himself appears at the shop, followed by a falcon, he demonstrates that he can make the burn return to the painting by burning incense he inherited from his father. Segawa inherited the same rare incense, and the two realize that they must be brothers. Note the repeated appearance of incense, likely another nod at the story that a knocked over incense burner is what warned the shogun of the attempt on his life. This isn't even the last time an incense burner appears. His position as retainer still poses Segawa Uneme in opposition to Ishikawa Goemon, and soon Hisayoshi's men try to capture Goemon, but he escapes. Disguised as an emissary from the imperial court, Goemon infiltrates the palace of Hisayoshi, but he is found out by the retainers and is surrounded, but not being one for fair play, Goemon uses magic to disappear, which is Finally, he confronts Hisayoshi, who, no longer disguised, throws a dagger at him which Goemon catches. Goemon accuses Hisayoshi of being the real thief for trying to steal Japan, and that he, not content with the country, is invading Korea too. He says that even he, Goemon, the king of thieves, is as nothing compared to a thief like Hisayoshi. As you may be able to imagine, this speech does not sway Hisayoshi into just hanging up his crown, and not just because the Japanese don't wear crowns. Instead, he brings out a hostage, the prince of the Ming dynasty, who is conveniently placed in a traveling case. Goemon, just as conveniently, magics away with the hostage. Afterwards, Goemon returns for an epic fight scene but ends up surrounded. This time he entrusts the stolen seal and an incense burner he stole to his brother, since the brother had fallen from grace after failing to catch him. This may look like a surrender, but the play ends as Goemon swears to continue his fight against Hisayoshi. He's still surrounded though. By the use of frequent fighting and magic in an Edo period play, we can see that the tendency to ascribe ninja qualities to Goemon is by no means a modern phenomenon. But that story isn't too hard to follow, is it? Sure, there's intrigue and loads of characters and everything, but it's comprehensible, right? Because I kid you not, I came across 2 different cases in which people said that you don't have to understand it to enjoy it. At first I was confused at this, it seems counterintuitive, but I think it's because Edo Period Kabuki was a day-long event where people would sometimes pop in for just a scene or two. As a consequence, there's a lot of visual spectacle, including opulent sets, lavish costumes, frequent dances and action scenes and so on, all to catch the audience's attentions at all times. So in a way, Kabuki is made to work out of context. But back to the play in question. What I found fascinating is the sheer complexity of the characters, Goemon especially. He's both cunning and loyal, ambitious and self-effacing. He's a deep and even insightful character, with a multitude of sometimes conflicting motivations. Let's return one last time to the scene on the gate and the confrontation with Hisayoshi. What is it about that poem that enrages Goemon so much? Well, it is actually a poem attributed to Goemon himself. The line, "Though there is an end to the sands on the beach, there is no end to the number of thieves in the world," in its original context is a challenge to the shogunate, an indication that any attempt at order is ultimately in vain, as there will always be thieves and disobedience despite the best efforts of the ruling class. In the words of our Hideyoshi lookalike, the meaning of the poem is corrupted, instead referring to the commonality of thieves. Especially from a man dressed as a humble pilgrim, this is a challenge to the man who wants to rule Japan from the man who does. This is made all the more ironic by the fact that Hideyoshi is of common birth, while Goemon, as the son of a general, at least in this story, is the son of a rather important figure. This scene is echoed later at the palace when Goemon faces Hisayoshi, only this time the roles are very much reversed. Goemon is placed below and accuses Hisayoshi of being the thief. Here, the tensions inherent in the shogunate's position are made explicit. The historical Hideyoshi unified Japan despite coming from a peasant family. He then turned his attention outwards, possibly because it was the only way he could still hope to improve his position. And despite being unable to become the Tenno, he had effectively replaced him with what was, let's be perfectly clear here, a military dictatorship. True, that dictatorship had been subsumed by the Tokugawa shogunate by the time the play came out, but the social critique would have still been relevant for the Japanese. And it is clear from this scene that the populace was by no means ignorant of this conflict. Goemon was therefore a transgressive figure, a voice piece for critique of the ruling class and a symbol of resistance. In this case, perseverance in the face of the brutality of the regime. What complicates this interpretation is that Hideyoshi's death had led, ultimately, to the collapse of his personal regime and that Tokugawa Ieyasu had taken over. However, for all intents and purposes, Hideyoshi and Ieyasu, as well as his successors, had positions that were almost identical for the metaphor of the play. They were unifiers of Japan, were military dictators and operated independently, if not in defiance of the Tenno, and the Tokugawa shogunate enforced the class system established by Hideyoshi, even though they both started from relatively humble positions. Therefore, though the play was first performed almost 200 years after Hideyoshi's death, the social critique would have been applicable to the current regime of the audience. Much like Shakespeare used his historical plays for critique of the current rulers, because just telling your local king, shogun or whichever dictator you have lying around the house that he sucks tends to end less than satisfactory, even if you're nice enough to write a play about it. But in his unbending opposition to the government, Goemon differs from Robin Hood, whom he is often compared to. While Robin Hood may have originally been set in opposition to the ruling class, he was subsequently turned into a figure in support of said rulers. That happened by differentiating between rightful and unrightful rulers. Sure, the peasants are being oppressed, but that's because of that rascal the Sheriff of Nottingham. Now, as soon as King Richard the Lionhead, who's the real king, gets back, everything is as it should be. No more need for any of that resisting or stealing from the rich and giving to the poor stuff, thank you very much. You may give back the gold. Now, Goemon doesn't suffer this affliction. Even in the Kabuki play, where he aims to kill the shogun, there is no notion that he will reinstate the Tenno. Instead, he acts purely in opposition of the ruling class, at least that of Japan. In a way, it is the death of Goemon, impossible to ignore as it is, that anchors his legend. The fact that he was executed for thievery in such a famous, if gruesome way, gives him one bit of characterization that cannot be ignored, and that is a conflict with the ruling class. While Robin Hood's unbending bit of narrative, that he stole from the rich and gave to the poor, was more easy to manipulate. Ironically, this preserved Goemon's role as an anti-authoritarian figure and as a friend to the people, even though his portrayal isn't as inherently benevolent as Robin Hood's. So Goemon can be anything you like, a hero or a villain, benevolent or evil, a pompous lout or a masterful ninja, but he will never be blindly obedient. And with this, we close the curtain on Ishikawa Goemon, greatest thief in all Japan.